Because the most dangerous people in our history are those who think you can achieve the kingdom of God in this world.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Does Christianity still have a place in the public square? And what can it contribute to the broader culture? That's what we'll be discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us from our production studio in Rochester, Minnesota. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon, good to see you.
Let's catch people up on a couple of trips you've taken recently. One was to the Heritage Foundation, which is a big think tank located in Washington, D.C. What were you there for, and how did it go?
Well, I was there in D.C. for the USCCB meeting, so I'm chair now of what they call the Limb-Fly Committee. That's laity, marriage, family life, and youth. So I chaired that committee, and then as chair of that committee, I'm also on what they call the administrative committee. So I had a couple of days of committee meetings. Then it was the close of that second day that I went to the Heritage Foundation. They invited me to give the Russell Kirk lecture, which is one of their annual lectures. I've been a fan of Russell Kirk for a long time. So I accepted that invitation and wrote a paper on, Catholicism and democracy, Catholicism in America. It's entitled, I think if I get it right, it was the breakdown of the Tocquevillian equilibrium. So I'm talking there about what Tocqueville saw in the 19th century, that American liberal democracy will survive only in the measure that it has a clear religious and moral kind of ballast. You take that away, it'll revert to its kind of cruder Hobbesian form. So that was my argument, that what we're seeing today is in fact a breakdown of religion and morality. And so we do indeed see a return to more Hobbesian forms. So it's kind of controversial area. I was wading into a lot of controverted waters, but it was an interesting talk to give.
Second interesting trip you have, we've talked about it briefly in the past several months here, but it was your visit to London. If I'm not mistaken, this was planned and scheduled twice, and this was kind of the third go-around. But you went there in part to talk about the theme of today's show, what Christianity brings to the public conversation. You were there from February 4th through the 15th, 2023. Give us some brief highlights of that trip.
Well, I love that trip. You're right, it was like 3 times delayed because the COVID twice, and then the death of the Queen. We were just about to go last September, and the night we were due to leave, the Queen died, and so it was postponed a third time. Loved it. I spoke at Parliament. We'll talk a bit about that, I think, today. I said Mass at Westminster Cathedral, visited the jail cell of St. Thomas More, gave a talk to about 1,300 Catholics at the Queen Elizabeth II Center, visited with a lot of the leadership of the church in England. So the week was just marvelous. I love London and love all the kind of Catholic overtones there. The tour I got of Parliament, I'd never been inside the Parliament buildings. I'd seen them, of course, from the outside, but it was just a thrill. So the whole trip was marvelous.
Well, I'd like to spend the rest of this talk going through the major points you made in your address to Parliament. So you were given the opportunity to speak. If I'm not mistaken, lots of politicians in that room, both Catholic and non-Catholic alike. Interestingly, you began your talk to Parliament, which was on this theme of what Christianity can bring to the public conversation, with Mahatma Gandhi, a non-Christian. So why him? What does he reveal to us about this question?
Well, I think Gandhi enabled a lot of people in his own time, and indeed in our time, to see our own Christianity with fresh eyes. So Gandhi comes to London as a young law student in the 1880s. At first, they say so shy, he barely was able to leave his room. But eventually fell in with a group of Christians, and he was kind of an insatiably curious person. And he asked about the Bible, and they gave him a Bible. And like a lot of first-time readers of the Bible, he was a bit put off by the Old Testament. It didn't make sense to him. But the New Testament he read, and it electrified him, especially the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. And what he saw there, of course, was enemy love, nonviolence, turn the other cheek, all of this kind of central dynamic of the moral life in terms of that sermon. He went to a lot of his Christian friends at the time, and he said, hey, I found these marvelous texts, and the Christians kind of, well, those are nice ideals, or no one really takes it all that seriously. But of course, Gandhi took it very seriously indeed, brought it back home to India and launched a social revolution based on those principles. My point there was, I think we Christians have grown maybe somewhat jaded about our own Christianity, that it's so, oh, it's old Christianity. Sure, we all know what that is. And in fact, we don't know what it is. That it bears enormous power, that it's still a remarkably distinctive vision of the world, and, as Gandhi ironically proved, has enormous social implication and political power to change the world. So I kind of invoke Gandhi for our own time, because I think we Christians now in the West are largely in the state that many of his friends were in the late 19th century, of like, oh yeah, these old biblical texts, we all know them, but no one takes them very seriously. Well, Gandhi helps us to see just how radical they are.
From Gandhi, you next move to St. Augustine and his masterful work, City of God, in which he makes the simple but compelling argument that individuals and societies become what they worship, and therefore getting worship right is key to the flourishing society. What follows if, as a society, our worship is misdirected?
Yeah, that was Augustine's central point, I think, in the City of God, and one of the most important observations in the whole Western tradition. As you say, very simple but very telling. Because see, what you worship is what you think is of highest value. Therefore, everybody worships something. You're a professed atheist, okay, but you're worshiping something. There's some value, there's some moral ideal, there's some person, there's some culture, there's something you are holding of highest value. Now, the rest of your life will flow from that, right? You're going to organize your life around that which you think is of highest value to you. It'll motivate every decision that you make. So it'll tell you all you need to know about yourself, really. What do you worship? Everything will follow from that. What Augustine saw was, and read the City of God, if you have the intestinal fortitude for the details, he saw that Roman society worshipped these very fallen gods, gods who were vain and argumentative and jealous and violent and embodying many of the worst qualities of human beings. Well, why are we surprised, therefore, Augustine concluded, that our societies become that way, that we're honoring these, he saw them really as fallen figures. Christianity proposes the worship of the God whose name is love, the God of love, to will the good of the other. If you say that's of the highest value to you, then things like mercy, compassion, forgiveness, nonviolence become central to the way you organize your own life and the life of the society. I think that insight of Augustine is still of enormous importance today. So to ask in our society, what do we worship? What do we hold up as the highest value? Everything else will follow from that. I would dare say, Brandon, we've talked about a lot today, something like freedom, self-assertion, that I decide, that's the highest value, is autonomy. Well, all right, you're going to get a certain society that from that act of worship.
We might ask ourselves, following Augustine's lead, what does it look like for a society to rightly worship, the true God of love? And Jesus' answer is the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount lays out the concrete form such a society would take. In your talk to Parliament, you highlighted especially Jesus' words about Christians being salt and light in society. What's this metaphor driving at?
That our job in the wider society is to be a leaven and a light and a direction. So modernity wants to make religion into a private matter. So it's like a hobby. It's like something I cultivate in my privacy. But that's not biblical at all. In the Bible, the purpose of being a Christian is to be a light for others, is to be leaven for others, is to be salt, which preserves what's worth preserving, salt that puts to death what should be put to death, right? That our lives are other-directed. We have a function precisely in the society. The irony is that we tend to think of religion as, well, that's not about politics and economics and society. It's about what you do in your privacy. No. We're a city on a hill. Well, in the ancient world, That meant that was your GPS. That's how you'd navigate. Like, oh, there's that city up there. Oh, and now I'm south of it, now I'm north of it, The light, well, that's how you see where to go. Well, what don't you do? You don't put the light under a bushel basket. You don't privatize it, hide it away. You don't hide the city on the hill. You make it more visible, right? So that's the role of Christians, is to be a sign of contradiction, a sign of direction. We exist precisely for the wider society.
There's this tension that I think still exists for a lot of Christians, that on the one hand they recognize, yes, we're meant to be salt and light in the culture and the political world, but on the other hand, they see such resistance toward Christianity and toward Christian principles. There's a temptation to just flee, to go to the hills, to retreat.
Yeah.
How do we handle this tension?
Well, there are times in church history when great people have done just that. Think of the beginning of the monastic movement in the early days. Go back in the 4th century, almost everybody of significance wanted to run to the hills. At times, society becomes so antipathetic to us that that's all we can do. The absolute limit case of that is martyrdom, right, where the society aggressively puts to death Christians that stand to thwart it. But a little, lower degree would be some kind of monastic retreat from the world. Sometimes that's called for. I think at times we need that move. But I think that the general purpose is always now for the sake of the world. So whatever retreat I have, it's for the sake of returning to transform the society. So I would say that's the master metaphor.
I like how this links us back to ancient Israel, because as you said many times, God chose Israel not for themselves, but for the sake of the world. And so
Right.
Christians today are in a way the people of God for the world today, as the Israelites were in ancient times.
No, precisely. And the chosenness is never, hey, isn't Israel great? God must really love them. They're so morally accomplished. He chose them. No, on the contrary. The prophets keep saying, on the contrary. You were chosen as a sheer grace. You're the least of people. You're not very impressive. You're not one of the great kingdoms of the world, and you're not morally impressive at all. In fact, you guys are always failing. But nevertheless, God chose you for a mission. Same thing with us. We're the new Israel. We're grafted onto Israel, Paul says. All right, that's because we're of such moral attainment? No, on the contrary. But, I tell people at baptism sometimes, that a child is baptized, not because, the family thinks it's nice, or, it's going to, it'll celebrate this new life. And all right, that's all fine. But the major reason is because in the mystery of God's providence, that child's been chosen for work in the world. It's been chosen to be a missionary in the world. Not everyone's chosen for that. Now, it's not because you're special and all that. It's you've been chosen for the sake of the wider world. And that's why you're being baptized. It's a great mystery. Like Brandon, that you and your wife were brought together through a whole series of events, but we'd say not by chance or accident, but through God's providence, to give rise to your children, because they've got a task now. And you baptized them, you had them baptized because in God's providential design, they've got a role in the world. That's the right way to think about it.
Let's go back to Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. At the center of this great sermon is one of the most surprising, challenging, difficult teachings of all of Jesus's ministry, namely enemy love. Mm-hmm. Enemy love, to love your enemies. When we're talking about it at the political level, the social level, is that really practical today? And what might that look like for Christians involved in the public sphere to demonstrate enemy love?
Yeah, because it's never been practical. That's the thing. It's always run counter to all of our intuitions and institutions, which are really predicated upon, us against them and who's in, who's out. Enemy love, Brandon, is the great test of love, right? If love is to will the good of the other, as other. If I'm loving a friend or I'm loving someone who's an ally of mine, well, that's okay. I love them and they're going to love me back. I'll be kind to them, they'll be kind to me back. I don't really know for sure if I'm loving them. Am I willing their good, or am I willing my good through them, right? But when it comes to an enemy, someone that doesn't will me any good, on the contrary, they will ill to me. That's what makes them an enemy. Well, if I will their good despite that, then I really know I'm willing the good of the other and not my own good through them. So that's why it's central to the teaching of Jesus. It's the test of love. Now, your broader question about society is an interesting one, because does that mean, for example, that we would give up our armies, or we'd surrender any effort to defend our country, or that we would not be engaged in economic affairs and so on? No, I don't think so. Wasn't it Chesterton that said there's no contradiction between loving your enemy in warfare and killing him? Because you are still willing the good of the other as you're engaging in the defense of your own country. You're respecting what that other soldier is doing. So those aren't necessarily in contradiction to each other. It's an attitudinal move. Am I really willing the good even of those who stand athwart me and my purposes? And that's alive in any political, economic, social setting. Can I answer that question positively? As I'm in my business dealings, nothing wrong with making a profit, nothing wrong with being involved in the capitalist enterprise. But am I willing the good of the other as I do that? If I'm not, then I'm in some spiritual trouble.
The historian Tom Holland, not to be confused with the actor Tom Holland that plays Spider-Man, but the English historian Tom Holland, with whom you interacted with during your London visit. I think you guys had a big stage dialogue together. He's pointed out that one of the substantial things Christianity has contributed to the public conversation, to our commonly accepted culture today, is the principle that we should be concerned with the poor, the marginalized, and victims. He points out that this is hardly a universal moral truth. It's something we take for granted today, but not most cultures in the past. Instead, this came directly from Christianity. Tell us, how did this revolutionary idea emerge?
It came from the man on the cross. And Howard, I think, makes that point better than anybody today. And he does so as an historian of the ancient world. So his specialty is ancient Rome. And what he notices is, the Romans had virtues for sure, and they celebrated certain virtues. But among them would not be care for the poor and for the marginalized and for the forgotten. He said, Julius Caesar goes through Gaul conquering and, casually pushed to death millions of people in the process. No one back in Rome said, oh my goodness, how could he be doing that? What a brutal, fellow he is. I was going to take it for granted. He's on this, imperialistic rampage, and he does what he has to do. A child who was born with some sort of limitation or deformity, left out on the hillside, that was absolutely common practice in ancient Rome. The poor, those at a very low social level, if they were convicted of a crime, crucify them. So in other words, the view that, somehow we should be concerned for the weakest among us and the most vulnerable and the poorest, that we should have a sense of the rights, even of those who are lowest in the social ladder, that comes from a Christian conviction that God is identified with this crucified Jesus, that this rejected slave-like figure. Anyone that died on a cross was at the lowest level of the social ladder. The illusion, Howland thinks, I think he's right about this, and that's born of the Enlightenment, is that these values about individual rights and care for the poor and the marginalized, they identify those as universal values. So read the UN Declaration on Human Rights, that these are universal values. Well, yeah, they do have a universal application, that's true, but they're not universal in the sense of, everyone naturally understands these things. They, in fact, came through very particular Christianity. And he thinks it's terrible and grossly unfair that many in the West have forgotten this, and then don't give Christianity credit for this major cultural revolution that we're still part of. Even the most ferocious atheist and extreme left-wing person today would probably say, well, yeah, of course we care for the poor, and of course, we care for the marginalized, and of course the victim. Well, not of course. That comes from a Christian perspective. So that's an exceptionally important observation that Howland makes.
Here's one last point that you brought up in your Parliament talk, and it's Christianity's insistence on political realism, on the limits to what we can actually achieve through our political initiatives and programs. You pointed to that part of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus references the birds of the air and the lilies of the field and says they don't worry about what they're going to eat or what they're going to wear, and you should be like that too. This is not, as you say, an invitation to quietism or indifferentism, but a certain detachment from all of our political programs and initiatives, recognizing that we will never bring about the kingdom of God in its fullness in this world. Why is that a valuable idea?
Because the most dangerous people in our history are those who think you can achieve the kingdom of God in this world. This sort of immanentizing of the eschaton, that was the term that William F. Buckley used, is exceptionally dangerous. Because if I'm convinced I can do that through my social institutions and my political machinations and through revolution, I can create utopia. Well, what happens is, of course, I won't create utopia, but I'll keep trying and I'll keep trying and I'll press on it and press on it. And then you get to Lenin, you have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. And if the cracking of the eggs means tens of millions of people have to die to realize this social vision, I'll do it. See? But those who realize, no, in this life we'll never attain utopia, that's for a life to come, they'll practice politics, but with a certain detachment, with a certain realism. Think of someone like Reinhold Niebuhr in the last century was famous for this, that all we can expect is to be, he said, reasonably happy in this life. If you think, I can be perfectly happy in this life, God help everybody around you. Because you'll do whatever you can to make that happen, even if it means, the corpses pile up. So that's exceptionally dangerous point of view. That's one reason why I think it's one of the great principles of conservatism that is very healthy, it seems to me, is a sense of the limits of government and the limits of what can be attained in this world. And therefore a kind of realistic acceptance that we're never going to create a perfect world. All of our efforts are going to fall short. At the end of the day, at the end of all of our striving, we do indeed have to leave things to God. When you don't, you start thinking you are God and you can make it happen yourself, and then beware.
Well, let's wrap up with this question. In America today, where do you see Christianity having a positive influence on the public conversation, and where could it do better?
Well, bring forward what Tom Holland sees. Bring forward the fact that what's valuable, let's say, in the left wing today. So the tremendous interest in the rights of the poor and the marginalized and our concern for social justice and all that, that's Christian. Those are Christian ideals. Now, if they're divorced from God and from a sense of the transcendent, they'll devolve into the kind of wokeism that we see today. I think Christians can insert themselves very much into that conversation and say, yeah, you're getting this from the Sermon on the Mount ultimately, but don't forget the transcendent referent of the Sermon on the Mount. Otherwise, your concern for the poor and the marginalized will turn into a sort of wokist program. And that then becomes something dangerous. So maybe I say that, Brandon, the Christians ought to insert themselves right there into that conversation and say, the best of this you got from us. But don't forget the caution that's also embedded within a Christian view.
It's time now for our listener question. Every episode we play a question from one of our listeners and Bishop Barron answers it. If you have one that you'd like to send him, you can do so at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we hear from Ethan in Austin, Texas, and he has a question about post-modernity. Here's his question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Ethan from Austin, Texas. I was calling in to ask your opinion on what the Catholic response to post-modernity should be, and if their core presumption is that everything is predicated on power, what would be the Christian response to such a assertion on society? Thank you.
Well, gosh, we could do a whole program or a series of programs on that. My book, The Priority of Christ, in many ways is about this issue of postmodernism, post-liberalism in light of Christianity. I'll do a quick positive thing. I like the fact that the postmoderns call into question a certain hegemony and a certain domineering quality of modernity. So the view that comes up out of Descartes and Bacon and Locke and Jefferson and so on had a kind of hegemonic control over the Western mind. The postmoderns begin pulling on the loose strands of the modern program, and they open it up in a way to new possibilities, one of which is a recovery of religion. And so there's a religious side of the postmodern movement that I would identify with. So I think that's a positive. I like your insight about power because, Foucault and Derrida and company, that's what they saw. The problem is they saw everything through that lens. It's always the temptation for intellectuals is a reductionism. So Marx saw everything as economics. Freud saw everything as repressed sexuality. The Foucaultians see everything as the play of power and the disempowered. Take all those things and say, okay, fine as far as they go, but there's much more to life than simply that. And you see it in wokeism. What happens is this exaggerated stress on power and plays of power. Yes, that's a real dynamic within our societies, but it's not the only dynamic. And when you see all of life through that lens, you're going to get a very distorted vision. So I would say, read those people, but also read the wider tradition, and you see the rich complexity of forces and influences that affect us personally and societally, and resist, again, now a kind of new hegemony of the postmoderns. There's one right way to look at the world. There's one lens. I would strongly resist that in the name of Christianity.
Well, thanks, Ethan, for your question. Thanks to all of you for listening and watching. As we wrap up the episode here, I want to tell you about another exciting new book from Vogt and I. This one is titled As Kingfishers Catch Fire, Selected and Annotated Poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins, with an introduction and notes by Holly Ordway. Gerard Manley Hopkins is widely regarded as one of the greatest poets of the English language. He was a Jesuit priest, and he was known for his sophisticated but innovative style. Hopkins wrote poetry that expressed the full range of emotional and spiritual experience, taking readers through trials and triumphs before coming to a place of deep resignation in God. However, I have lots of friends who have tried to read Hopkins' poems, and while they recognize the beauty, they find them a little challenging to understand. They're stumped, they're beguiled. This new book by Word on Fire, though, takes 37 of the Victorian poet's greatest works and provides commentary, notes, cultural background, and references to help you understand Hopkins' word choice and his complex sentence structure. It features classics like The Windhover and God's Grandeur, but also various lesser-known poems, and so it's perfect for either the seasoned poet or the first-time reader. It will acquaint you with this brilliant mind of the Catholic tradition. Bishop, I didn't know if you have anything you wanted to add. I know you've been a fan of Hopkins for quite some time.
Yes, Mark, there's no one like him, and as you say, he is hard to read. But a lot of the great poets are that way, and you have to listen to them. I think the main thing is you listen to Hopkins first before you get to the meaning. Listen to the sounds. He's a singer. He's in that kind of bardic tradition. But there's no one like him. He's one of the most remarkable figures in all of 19th century literature.
So again, check out this new book, As Kingfishers Catch Fire. I'll include a link to it here in the show notes. Thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
We'll be right back.